Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring a truly chilling historical pattern documented in our source material. We're going to look at how civilizations, specifically focusing on the historical account of Bani Israel, didn't actually fall to sudden dramatic invasions or massive plagues. Instead, they dismantled their own foundations entirely from the inside out.
Now, the source points out something absolutely fascinating right off the bat. This wasn't a story of overpowering enemies beating down the gates. No, it was about a people who slowly, and frankly almost politely, embraced three very specific ideas. Ideas that were dressed up as deities in stone, bronze, and carved wood. So to really understand how a whole society just cooperates with its own destruction, we first have to look at the economic reality they were dealing with.
Think about the sudden shock of this transition. For 40 years out in the Sinai wilderness, Bani Israel had what you could call a guaranteed vertical economy. Their provision literally came straight from the sky. Manna, quail, springs of water bursting right out of rocks. They didn't have to stress about the weather. But the moment they crossed the Jordan River into the land of Canaan, they suddenly slammed into a horizontal economy. We're talking about a brutal, entirely rain-dependent agricultural reality. If the two rainy seasons failed, well, the crops rotted, the livestock died, and people starved.
Which brings us to number 1, Baal, the economic trap.
The crucial point of this first historical escalation starts right there in the dirt of the fields. That profound, gnawing anxiety over survival led to the introduction of our first concept, a deity known as Baal. And our sources point out a really important detail here. The Canaanite neighbors weren't actually asking the Israelites to completely abandon their god. When archaeologists dug up the ancient city of Ugrit, they found clay tablets that revealed a system of transactional religion. You see, this wasn't deep spiritual mysticism. This was pure economics. The Canaanites were essentially just suggesting a practical precaution. They treated these local deities like cosmic insurance agents. The pitch was simple. You bring some grain or animal blood to the altar of Baal because he's supposedly the lord of the sky, and he delivers the rain. To a terrified farmer who just wants to feed his family, hedging your bets like that seemed completely reasonable.
And this escalation perfectly captures the whole boiled frog technique of societal collapse. It started so small, but over 7 generations it morphed from quiet, occasional agricultural habits, praying to their creator for the afterlife, but maybe leaving a little offering for Baal just to secure this week's harvest, into full-blown, state-funded apostasy. By the time we get to Queen Jezebel and King Ahab, you have 450 priests of Baal being funded directly out of the royal treasury, while the true prophets are literally being hunted down.
This tension finally reached its absolute peak at the famous Mount Carmel showdown. According to the historical record, Prophet Ilas challenged these 450 priests of Baal after a devastating 3.5-year drought. And here's the crazy part. Even after Prophet Ilas proved Baal's complete powerlessness, when the sky stayed totally silent for the priests but fire and then pouring rain came down after just a single prayer from Ilas, the people's realization was only temporary. Our source notes this heartbreaking truth. They eventually reverted right back to that same illusion of control the very moment the next dry season hit.
Number 2, Asherah, the domestic compromise.
So, while Baal was dominating the public hilltops, a second threat was quietly moving indoors. It shifted from the public agricultural spaces straight into the most intimate areas of daily life. Meet Asherah, a Canaanite mother goddess of fertility. Now, it's crucial to grasp here is that she wasn't worshipped in massive, intimidating stone temples. Instead, as archaeologists have discovered, she just became part of the ordinary furniture of domestic life. We're talking about tiny carved wooden figurines found in ancient kitchens and sleeping quarters. A mother would be kneading bread and casually leave a small offering on the shelf, hoping for a safe pregnancy. It wasn't even viewed as grand idol worship anymore. It had just become a daily, unquestioned household habit.
And a staggering archaeological discovery made out in the Sinai Desert in 1975 proves exactly what this looked like in practice. They actually found this exact inscription. Think about what that means. It proves how profoundly the people tried to shrink their creator down to fit comfortably into their own domestic lives. They literally gave the Almighty a wife or a female counterpart, basically to make the stern God of their covenant feel a bit more approachable, more forgiving, and more domesticated.
But the ultimate symbol of this compromise is the number 55. That is the exact number of years King Manasseh kept a carved wooden Asherah idol sitting inside the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem. This was the innermost chamber, right? A room so overwhelmingly sacred that only the high priest was allowed to enter it, and only once a year. By casually placing a wooden fertility idol in there for over half a century, it proved they hadn't evicted God, they had just given him a roommate.
Number 3. Molech, the ultimate price.
Because we have to ask what happens when moderate desperation completely fails to bring rain and that anxiety over survival reaches its absolute terrifying peak. Well, this brings us to the darkest chapter of our source material. We're looking at Molech in the Valley of Hinnom, an area just outside the walls of Jerusalem. This is where transactional religion reached its horrifying but frankly logical conclusion, in a place known as Topheth, or the place of the drums. The source describes this massive hollow bronze statue with a fire burning continuously inside its belly. The heat was so intense that the statue's extended arms would literally glow red.
And look at how this twisted logic escalated. If the grain and the livestock offerings weren't costly enough to appease the sky and end the famine, well, the religious leaders managed to convince parents that sacrificing their own children was an act of necessary love just to save the rest of the family. And those deafening drums echoing in the valley? The priests actually called them mercy. They beat them so incredibly loud so the parents wouldn't be able to hear the screams of their own children and change their minds.
And to make themselves feel better about this unimaginable horror, especially when you had royal figures like King Ahaz actively sacrificing their own sons in that valley, the establishment actually went ahead and corrupted the historical record. They falsely claimed that the great prophet Suleiman had built shrines to Molech too. The source notes that this was just a transparent lie, carefully designed to soothe their own collective conscience. Their argument was basically, hey, if the great kings of the past did it, how can you possibly blame us?
Number 4. The silent withdrawal. Because they entirely ignored the constant warnings of the prophets and chose instead to trust blindly in the physical building of their temple rather than their moral covenant, the most devastating punishment of all occurred, and it happened entirely in silence. Islamic tradition preserves this heartbreaking account where the divine mercy, the Sakina, gradually withdrew from the temple step by step. It moved from the innermost chamber, out to the outer court, to the eastern gate, over the Mount of Olives, and finally ascended straight to the heavens. The tragic irony of it all is that the priests unknowingly kept right on performing their daily rituals inside what was now a completely empty, abandoned room.
And without that divine protection, the physical collapse followed extremely quickly. In 586 BCE, King Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian army arrived at the gates. And guess what? The idols completely failed to stop the destruction. Everything they had compromised their morals to protect was violently taken away. The temple was burned to the ground, the people were marched off into exile, and that cursed Valley of Hinnom? It was later turned into a perpetually burning garbage dump. The source actually points out that this specific physical place is the historical root of the Greek word Gehenna and the Arabic word Jahannam, meaning hellfire.
Number 5. The modern equivalence.
Now we arrive at what I think is the most profound thesis of our source material. It argues that these three ancient deities didn't actually die with the Babylonian conquest at all. No, they just changed clothes for the modern era. The source perfectly maps out how the exact same compromises that plague Bene Israel are quietly, effectively dismantling modern households today. And the domains are identical. We're talking about the economy, the home, and the sacrifices we make for the future.
So what does Baal look like today? Well, according to the source, Baal no longer lives on a hilltop. Today, he lives in our spreadsheets. He's in the career moves where we quietly remove our daily prayers, our salah, and our halal ethics just to stay economically competitive. It's that little voice in your head that whispers, just this once, just for this one deal, just until we're finally financially secure.
And what about the modern Asherah? That is the habit of customizing our religion to perfectly match our lifestyle preferences. It's keeping a little spiritual figurine on the shelf because we want the blessings and the warm identity of the faith, but we're actively ignoring or editing our deen, our faith, for comfort. It becomes this domesticated, incredibly comfortable version of belief that gets passed down unquestioningly from parent to child, completely stripped of any commands that might inconvenience us.
And finally, modern Molech. The source argues that this is the metaphorical fire we feed our children into when we prioritize their worldly and educational success over their spiritual connection to their Creator. We gladly schedule away the religious education for more extracurriculars, letting the deafening drums of social pressure and the sheer anxiety of comparison drown out the immense spiritual loss happening right in front of us. We sacrifice their deen simply because we are terrified they're going to fall behind in the world's eyes.
The overarching lesson from all of this is that societal and spiritual collapse just doesn't announce itself with trumpets. Shirk, associating partners with God, always arrives as a reasonable accommodation. It totally masquerades as practicality.
The source concludes that the only real defense against this creeping collapse is a pure, uncompromising Tawheed, a pure monotheism. It means absolutely trusting the provider even when the sky is locked tight, the fields are bone dry, and it feels like you desperately need a backup plan.
Ultimately, looking at the history of this quiet collapse forces every single one of us to look in the mirror. The explainer leaves us with one deeply unsettling question to confront about our own inevitable tests. What will you do when the drought comes?